Our darkest days in the battle against COVID-19 are ahead of us, not behind us. That was a grim warning given by our very own President-elect Joe Biden just days ago. The pandemic of 1918, also known as the Spanish flu, was known to be the worst pandemic in history, that is, before the COVID-19 pandemic came along. Parallels that can be drawn between these two pandemics illustrate why it's so important that we learn from history. So in this presentation, I will introduce you to the pandemic of 1918, and we will discuss demographics, the timeline, and the US response. So the difference between the flu in 1918 and the flu in subsequent years is that this flu was widely infectious. It spread across the world and quickly became a global pandemic. In the article History of the 1918 Flu Pandemic by the CDC, they described that 500 million people were infected. And that is a third of the world's population, to put it in context for you. A third of the world's population at the time. Anyone at the time could get that flu. It was regardless of sex, age, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity. Anyone could get it and possibly die from it. In Nancy Bristow's book, American Pandemic, The Lost Worlds of 1918 Influenza Pandemic, she describes a caveat to that year's flu, and it's that young and healthy people were especially struck hard. With this in mind, that flu didn't just sweep across the world once and just stop there. The influenza virus came in 3 waves. The first wave was virtually unnoticeable. In that same book, Nancy Bristow continues to describe that the first wave of the virus was unnoticed, unheralded, and indistinguishable from the annual irritant. Now that included the reaction of the troops in World War I as well as the general public, but then the virus mutated. The second wave was the most deadly. In the History Channel article in 2020, they described that the second wave was especially rapidly spread, especially by troop movement. And in a 2019 article by the National Institutes of Health, they continue to describe that the migration of refugees as well as mobility of women engaged in domestic activities also helped the spread of the virus, the rapid spread. Now this explains the magnification that we see in the second wave in this graph. And the third wave was a lot smaller, and that was because at that time, finally during the second wave, public health measures were finally put into place. Now these public health measures included masks, isolation, the closing of businesses, the prohibiting public gatherings. And in a 2007 article, it's called The Pandemic Influenza, Studying the Lessons from History, Stephen Morse described that there was no single public health intervention that was super effective, but there were a few that were more effective than others. Another public health intervention that was put in place was public health education programs. And in a CDC article that was last reviewed in 2018, it describes that these public health education programs educated the general public on the dangers of coughing and sneezing. So I hope we all learned something from this presentation that will continue to inform us in our continued response into the COVID-19 pandemic. So today I introduced you to the pandemic of 1918, and we talked about the demographics of it, the timeline, and the US response to it. Now this topic is more relevant now than ever as we're experiencing a resurgence in our COVID-19 virus. There's so much to be learned from what history has to offer us. Thank you. I will now open up the floor for questions. Yes. Okay, so the question is, how long did the pandemic of 1918 last? And the answer to that is it lasted about 2 years. So it lasted from February 1918 to April 1920. Are there any more questions? Yes. Okay, so the question was, why didn't they create a vaccine to keep from having a second wave and third wave? The answer to that, as far as my research goes, the flu vaccine was not available then. And let's keep in mind that I mentioned that the virus actually mutated, and the mutated virus is what caused the second wave. So any vaccine that was developed to the first strain of the flu that came in the first wave would not have been affected in the second wave. And public health measures were actually the most effective prevention strategy at the time. All right, if there are any more questions, I'll be in the back. Thank you.